Hello everyone and welcome to Turning Point UK's very first episode of the Esther Krakue Show. This is a regular podcast we're going to be doing. We're going to be interviewing prominent figures in media, politics, culture, and just to find out what's really going on in Britain with a conservative twist on it. Today I'm joined by Douglas Carswell, a former Tory and UKIP MP and now the host of the Carswell podcast. And now we're just going to be talking about everything Brexit in the UK and everything that's going on. All right?
Esther, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Thank you. I'm just going to ask you a few questions, mostly about to start with, your history as an MP.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how did you first get started in politics?
I was in my early 20s, university, and I decided Britain should leave the European Union. I had a conversation with a young guy in his early 20s, same age as me, called Dan Hannan, and he managed to convince me
to get into politics.
That we should campaign to leave the European Union, and the way to do that was to join the Conservative Party. It's been a long march, but a few bumps along the way, but it looks like we're winning.
Had you always sort of been, a Conservative supporter, or did you kind of wane in your political leanings?
I think I was always pretty instinctively conservative. I mean, I grew up in the 1980s, mm-hmm. and I actually grew up outside the UK. I grew up in Uganda, and I looked in occasionally as an outsider would at what was going on in the UK. And I was really struck growing up about the fact that after years of decline, the country was getting off its knees. Mm-hmm. And it was because, in my young boy's mind, it was because of this person called Margaret Thatcher. Yeah. So I guess I instinctively always knew that she was a good thing. And so when I came to Britain and came to politics, it was pretty much with the idea that Thatcher was good and the people who were against her were slightly daft. And, the idea...
That's a nice way to put it.
And I think the public kind of agreed with that. She never lost an election.
Yeah.
And then when I was at university in my early 20s, I saw these low-grade nobodies getting rid of her, the most successful prime minister this country's had in half a century, because they wanted Britain to join a European superstate. I thought, we can't be having this.
And even back then, did you have this notion that sort of the common market, as it was called, was going to turn into this superstate?
Yeah, I read a book, I don't want to sound too wonkish, but I read a book by a guy called Paul Kennedy. He used to teach at my university, he had left by the time I got there, called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And it's probably, I was quite a lazy student, it's probably the only book I actually read. And it basically explained why Europe was so successful historically, because it was never centrally run the way that China and India and the Mughal Empire and all the rest of them were run. And it had quite a profound impression on me. I kind of realized that actually the whole European integration project was actually completely contrary to what is authentically the European tradition. And
kind of like a survival of the fittest nationalism model, isn't it?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, it's systems competition. It's like in the States. In the States, you've got 50 different states, and they do things differently in each state, and that allows policy innovation. It allows Wisconsin to come up with great ideas on welfare reform. It allows charter schools in New York to lead the way that the rest of the country then follows. Europe used to have that systems competition model too. It was never run centrally. And I would also argue that the bits of Europe that weren't run by the centre, by the Holy Roman Empire, were the most successful bits. Venice in the Middle Ages, the Dutch Republic, and, crucially, Britain. So my reading of history made me reinforce this idea that actually the European Union is a catastrophic way of organising an entire continent. And do you know what? I'm in my 40s now, and every year since then, we've seen Europe become relatively less successful and the rest of the world becoming relatively more successful. I think it's time to recognise the European model sucks.
Was that sort of the turning point for you? It was when Britain decided to join the common market, which is now, I don't know really what it is now, but was that the turning point for you when you said, actually I need to get involved in politics?
Well, Britain had joined what was the common market long before I was politically conscious. I think I was still in nappies at the time, but there was a key moment, I think, when Britain joined the so-called single market in 1992, and we were told by our political leaders that this was going to make Britain more successful economically. And then we were told that if we integrated and joined the euro, we would become more successful. And actually, slowly, I think the penny started to drop with me that actually the economic rationale for being part of this club just didn't add up. Sure, there were certain economic vested interests who wanted us to join because it gave them a protectionist market. But actually for the rest of us, for the consumer, for the ordinary man or woman in the street, being in the EU's made us poorer. And quite an interesting moment in my life was I went off to Italy in my early 20s to work in television.
Yep.
And
wow. Did you speak Italian? Or
no,
English?
I spoke a bit of Italian, but I had great fun living in Rome for a number of years. And what had quite a profound effect on me was the number of young Italians, friends of mine I knew, who just couldn't get work the way people in London could. And in fact, weirdly, quite a few of them ended up having to come to London to get work. And this made me realise, you know what, the EU is not just about British interests. The EU and Brussels are actually bad for all Europeans.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think has been the shift? Because a lot of people that did vote, to join the common market, what do you think was the shift for them when they actually realised, the EU is not what they initially voted for? I mean, we have a common market. How does a common market evolve to, freedom of movement, a single currency? They're telling you to tax tampons. That doesn't look like a common market anymore. Yeah. You can't even fish in your own waters without the freedom to do so. I mean, what was the shift, do you think, for people that actually did vote to join the common market?
Well, initially we were told, join this club, the common market. You'll lose a little bit of political freedom to decide your own policy, but look, you'll become really, really rich. And in the late 1970s, this country was a basket case. It was failing economically. It had 30 years of socialism. And we felt pretty exhausted as a country. And it was quite a compelling idea that actually this would suddenly overcome all those problems. And in a moment of weakness and madness, we signed up to this. Actually, I think we now realise that the way to prosper is actually through the hard slog of getting rid of socialism, liberalising your labour markets, going through the tough process of economic reform. It was very, very difficult for many people in the 80s to do that. Unemployment got to 3 million. Margaret Thatcher had to fight and win a lot of battles. But that was what made this country and has made this country successful economically. Being in the European Union has actually hampered that because it's the source of restrictive regulations. Even in the past couple of years, the European Union has created a whole bunch of regulations on the use of data, the so-called GDPR regulations. This is inhibiting companies from doing all sorts of creative ideas and intelligent innovation that we're seeing now in America and China and happening throughout the rest of the world. I've got a particular interest, and I had as a Member of Parliament, a particular interest in the development of drugs, particularly to fight cancer. Yeah. People I know, loved ones have had and have died of cancer, with diseases which we can, I hope, soon learn to cure. But the process of developing new drugs, of clinical trials, has been inhibited by an EU regulation that was introduced. At the time that was introduced in the early noughties, about 12% of all clinical trials around the world happen in the UK. Since that restrictive EU regulation was introduced, I think something now like 1%.
1%, yeah.
So
the Americans effectively and the Chinese have effectively monopolised of that market of the China market.
Or you could say that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that the Europeans have shot themselves in the foot.
Own, really, yeah. I mean, I think I want to shift it a bit to sort of the Labour-Tory split, because when we first decided to join the common market, it sounded like a good idea, particularly to Labour voters, because obviously the economy was a bit sluggish, and they are the people that bear the biggest brunt. But in the Brexit referendum, we saw that I think 60% of Labour constituencies actually voted to leave the EU. Do you think this split, with the whole Brexit debate, do you think it's a left versus right sort of split, or what do you think it is? Do you think it's sort of a democracy versus non-democracy kind of split? Because we're seeing a lot of Labour voters actually shift to a side that we actually think the EU has always been to benefit the worker and to increase wages and all the rest of it, but we're seeing actually a lot of Labour voters are sort of shifting. So where do you think the Brexit argument or debate lies? Do you think it's more of a left versus right sort of split?
I think the real divide is between the privileged and ordinary people. There's a certain kind of person who maybe they have a house in London. Maybe the value of that house has gone through the roof over the past 20 years, not because they're a genius, but through sheer luck. They're able to have a job in financial services because they happen to graduate from the right university at the right time 20, 30 years ago. They've done very well for themselves. They've benefited from cheap air travel to Europe. They maybe have a villa in Tuscany. Yeah. And they get their opinions from the FT and from The Economist and from The Guardian. And they think that somehow they have an entitlement to decide what happens with this country. Ordinary people, I wouldn't classify them as necessarily Labour voters or Tory voters, but ordinary folk, people who live outside the Westminster bubble. Ordinary people, I think, don't share and slightly resent this sense of entitlement that the elite in this country have. I mean, I'm not a Marxist. I'm not a class warrior. I don't think it's good to talk in terms of class division. But I think there is a privileged oligarchy in this country that for years and years has been used to having things its way. And it sees the referendum result and the idea we might leave the European Union as an affront. And I think they're playing with fire because they think that, they are 48%. Actually, I think they're a lot smaller than that. There are an awful lot of people who voted Remain because they responded to the intimidation and the manipulation of the political agenda by the elite. But, the sort of people who produce programs on Radio 4 and the sort of fraudcasters who produce the news that we see on mainstream television, they're losing their ability to control the political agenda in this country, and Brexit is part of that. And it's wonderful to see ordinary people, whether they come from a traditional Labour background or a traditional Tory background or a traditional stuff, a lot of them background, actually waking up to the fact that, politics doesn't need to be like this. We don't need to defer to the grandson of Winston Churchill in order to have an opinion about something.
Yeah. And I mean...
and by the way, Question Time doesn't have to be done by somebody called Dimbleby.
Oh gosh. I mean, I think that you've pretty much hit the nail on the head right there. I mean, I actually did vote to remain in the EU, but I think...
Well, no one's perfect, Esther.
Yeah, I forgive myself, yeah. No, but, I think what you've said there really hits the nail on the head. I was, I think I was a university student, I was in France, all I heard was, if you vote to leave the EU, you're uneducated and you're going to lose all the benefits of sort of freedom of movement. And then I don't even know when the penny dropped, but it was just like, why should I actually vote to stay in an institution so I can have the convenience to sort of jet set around Europe without thinking of the cost to local Brits? What about Brits that actually like to live in Britain and,
But also, it's a nonsensical argument. I mean, if you live in a country that's not in the European Union, are you not able to travel cheaply around the world?
Yeah, exactly.
Do they not have mobile phones and cheap air travel in Switzerland? And many of the arguments that we have to remain in the European Union in order to prosper are simple nonsense when you stop and examine them. Of course, if you've been in a bureaucratic series of legalistic arrangements for a generation and you come out of those, there is going to be some disruption. Yeah. That's why it's really important that Gove and Dom Cummings are now working out how to minimize that disruption. But the idea that the country that has the fifth largest economy in the world, a country of 60 million people, a country that is such a wonderful place to live in that people from around the world are queuing to get in here. The idea that this country can't manage its own affairs and has to defer the idea of its self-government to people like Donald Tusk and Michel Barnier, it's ridiculous, it's absurd. And you've only got to put it in those terms to realise what a nonsense it is. Now, the problem is not whether Britain is ready for self-government, it's whether or not those who govern us are up to the task. And I don't think they are. And I think this now needs to change.
I was just going to ask you about that because, we had this referendum. Obviously, the majority of people voted to leave the EU. Where do you think our MPs stand in comprehending this? Because, Boris has been in power, a few weeks. He's been completely, optimistic about us leaving the EU. He was mayor of London, He has a fair knowledge about this. And the MPs have just fought him at every step.
Yep.
And it's just ridiculous. I mean, just look at what happened, in the last vote. Where do you think the MPs stand in terms of actually understanding the job?
Well, just stop and think about it. 3 years ago, we heard the same people making exactly the same arguments as to why we shouldn't vote to leave, and we voted to leave. And 3 years later, we're hearing exactly the same people repeating those arguments as an excuse not to deliver on the referendum result. How many times do we have to vote before politicians wake up and give us what we voted for? Now, there's this lie that they tell us, which is that people didn't know what it was they were voting for. Hang on. The ballot paper was really clear. Do you want Britain, do you want the United Kingdom to remain in the European Union or to leave the European Union? People know what they were voting for. David Cameron was absolutely crystal clear. He said that if you vote to leave, Britain will leave. You have the final choice. They sent a pamphlet at great expense to every household in the country that said the government will implement what you decide. So why are we even having this argument 3 years later? I'll tell you why.
It's still the elitist debate, isn't it?
It's because the political class will not accept that politics is something that the people have a say in. They think that it should be for them to decide. And so they've created these, frankly, absurd arguments. One of the arguments that you'll hear is that no one voted for a no-deal Brexit. Well, hang on. The idea that we voted to leave on condition that we would only leave with the permission of the EU is ridiculous. What all this tells us is that we have, I think partly because of our EU membership, a parasitic political class who are more interested in their own vested interests. These are career politicians who've gone straight from universities to being special advisors to being parachuted into safe seats. This parasitic political class. And home rule now needs to mean we change who rules at home. We need to get rid of a lot of them. And what they've done over the past week, incidentally, the umpire in the House of Commons, Burko.
Oh my goodness.
He's supposed to be neutral. Imagine if you were watching a game of rugby and halfway through the referee picked up the ball and ran with it from one side. This is what he's done. He's absolutely failed to live up to
I don't think he's even trying to hide it at this point.
No,
I mean, and what shocks me the most is, all these Tory MPs that decided to vote against the government. Are they trying to stay MPs? Because now I'm pretty sure we're sort of heading towards a general election. I don't think I'll hear of them ever again.
Well, what's really interesting is since some of the, let's call them what they are, they're the Brexit blockers.
Yeah.
Since some of I would call them the Brexit blockers. Since some of the Brexit blockers lost the whip, some of them have didn't happen to leave voters. They've got regret over how they voted. Some of them are now starting to say it's unfair that they're not going to be allowed to stand as Tory MPs. Hang on. These guys not only sided with Jeremy Corbyn to try to take away power from Boris Johnson, they colluded with Barnier and the Eurocrats to bring forward a bill that they knew would hamstring their government and thwart Brexit. They shouldn't be in public life, let alone on a Conservative ticket.
I don't think they should even be seen in public anymore, unless everyone has, a stack of rotten tomatoes. I just think it's shocking. No matter, this is why I think MPs are too comfortable. Because to be a good MP, you just have to do what the people say.
Esther, when I fell out with my party over Europe, this was when David Cameron and George Osborne ran the show, and I had a big bust up. And you know what I did? I didn't wait to be thrown out. I left, and I went back to my constituency in Clacton, and I said, right, let's have a by-election. I'm going to stand for a referendum. And I made it clear that the by-election was about getting a referendum on the EU. And I got re-elected. I got re-elected again in the general election that followed, basically running as an independent, as UKIP, but fundamentally as an independent. Yeah. I wish some of these 21 Brexit blockers who've been kicked out would have the decency to admit that they're absolutely terrified of going back to their constituents. They're not. I mean, sure, they spend a lot of time on Radio 4 talking to other people who listen to Radio 4 about what heroes they are, but not a single one of them has the courage or the nerve to do what they should do, which is to go back and get a mandate from the voters. The moment the general election comes, these guys are toast, thankfully.
Oh, thankfully. I mean, with the general election, what do you think is the best strategy, giving us free advice here, to, Boris Johnson at this point in time? Because I don't think there's anyone with, a sensible head on their shoulders that actually thinks Jeremy Corbyn stands a chance of,
It's a really simple choice. You got Boris Johnson and Brexit, or Corbyn and what I would categorise as communism. And you've got the most extreme left-wing Labour Party that not only wants to stop Brexit, but is run by people who think that, the government should impose rent controls, that the government should do all kinds of things. I was interviewing one of the great intellectuals behind the Corbynista movement just the other day. And
I'm sorry. Oh God.
It didn't take long. And they were talking about imposing capital controls. I mean, these
rent controls,
capital controls, controlling imports and exports. They really do look at Venezuela as their role model. Venezuela, where the socialists promise paradise, but people end up eating their pets.
Yeah, I was just about to say people are suffering from malaria and eating their dogs. But I mean, do you think strategically it would make sense for Boris to have a pact with the Brexit Party or sort of run so? Because I'm of the opinion at the moment I don't really want to vote for the Tories just because I don't want to have. I don't want anything to do with these sort of traitor MPs, so to speak. I want to just see Boris and his vision in terms of sort of delivering Brexit. Whether you are for or against Brexit, this is about sort of the future of this country. Do you think it would be a wise move strategically for Boris to sort of back the Brexit party? Or what do you think he should be looking to do?
If you want Brexit as passionately as I do, as passionately as I did the day I left the Tory party to join UKIP to trigger that by-election, arguably to light the fuse that started this whole process or helped start this process. If you believe as passionately as I do, get behind Boris. And let me tell you why. Because
Boris pitch.
If you're tempted to say, all these Tory toffs are idiots, look, you can't trust them, look at what they've done.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand that. I felt that way so passionately, I actually walked out of that party 5 years ago, almost to the day. But it's changed, and it's changed for one reason, because for the first time, the Tory party in my lifetime is led by someone who genuinely wants to leave the European Union, Boris Johnson. He led the Leave campaign. And if he was like the rest of them, if he was like John Major and Cameron and Theresa May, and he was, equivocating and making you promises before election time to get your vote before he can go off to Brussels and guffaw with the rest of them, if he was like that, he wouldn't have fired those 21. Sacking those 21 Brexit blockers tells me that he's serious about this.
Yeah. All right, that makes sense. I mean, we'll see what happens. I mean,
and incidentally, I hope that maybe there might be one or two extra Tory MPs who find that they're...
Get the sack.
Get the sack, yeah. I mean, why not? Why not?
I mean, they should. I think at this point, like I said, it doesn't really matter whether you voted Leave or Remain, because the reality is it's been 3 years. The public is just sick of this. Even the general election, we're just tired of hearing about Brexit this, Brexit that. The reality is we've had 3 years to sort of get over it and to be comfortable with the idea and actually look on the bright side of actually leaving the European Union. What do you think will be the sort of scenario looking ahead? What do you think will happen sort of by October 31st at the general election, 3-5 years ahead? Do you even think some of the MPs that stood against sort of Boris will even have a career in that time?
Well, I think there'll be a lot of attention paid to the Tory bed blockers who Boris has kicked out of the party, but the attention will be from the media. I think when they come to stand in their constituencies, they'll discover that actually they're nowhere. Some of them think they've got a personal following, but you're talking about 500-600 votes for each of them. Some of them are clever enough to realise that they'll be humiliated and will find a pretext to go off. Some will probably try and cut a deal with the Lib Dems. Frankly, who cares? If look at it from Boris's point of view, look at it from the country's point of view, you get rid of 20 Tory Brexit blockers and you exchange their support for the support of 17.5 million Leave voters. Yeah. And I think actually there are a lot of decent, patriotic, good people who voted Remain, an awful lot of them who voted Remain, who realise that actually they were sold Remain on a false prospectus. They were told that if we leaved, certain things would happen, and it just hasn't happened. The idea that there'd be 500,000 increase in unemployment if we voted to leave, and that was even before we actually left. That hasn't happened. People realise that actually the reason why this country is a great success, the reason why people from around the world want to come and live here, the reason why this country is the single biggest recipient of foreign investment, with the exception of China, it's because of the way we organise ourselves here. It's not because of whether or not French customs has given us permission to sell them whatever it is we sell.
Cheese or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that sort of without a Brexit party Tory pact, the Leave vote will split? I mean, I'm of the opinion that a lot more people have probably joined the Leave campaign after seeing sort of this farce of what we call democracy after the last 3 years. But there is an argument that if you don't have the sort of Tory Brexit hardcore pact, that the Leave vote will actually be split, and God forbid they fall in the hands of Corbyn.
Well, it could be that if some people are tempted to vote for the Brexit party, that could cost Boris Johnson some seats. I do worry about that. But let me put it another way. I know a thing or two about breakaway Eurosceptic parties and what they can and can't achieve. When I left the Tory party and joined UKIP, we went on as a party to get nearly 4 million votes. That was a very, very high percentage. It's a higher percentage of votes than the Brexit party is currently polling. And do you know how many seats we won in the general election that followed? Just me. Yeah. I don't mean to say this in a bad way, and I was the only beneficiary of people voting for UKIP in that election. But a vote for any other party is a wasted vote. And I think the big difference now is the leader. At the time, the Tory party was led by David Cameron. It was then led by Theresa May, and none of them could be trusted when it came to the Europe question. Yeah. But Boris can. This guy led the Leave campaign. This guy walked out of the cabinet way ahead of anyone else because he didn't like May's deal. This guy has credibility on this issue. Now, you'll hear people on the left saying, oh, he wrote 2 speeches, he's a joker, he's a clown. No, he's not. He's deadly serious.
This was London's mayor. This was a huge face in the Conservative Party. For him to come out to say, actually, we should leave the European Union after sort of managing one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world, I think that really...
He's deadly serious. And if I may say, unlike a lot of the other Leave figures I can think of, Boris knows how to make Brexit a success because he makes it a question of optimism. Instead of campaigning for a post-Brexit Britain that is narrow and nationalistic and angry and inward-looking, we know that if Boris is Prime Minister, Brexit will be about being an open, generous, outward-looking country. Yeah, this is a guy who thinks that actually you need to sort of open up and liberalize in order to be a successful society. Yeah. This is not an angry UKIPper, and I fear that if you do a pact, what will happen is you will get no extra MPs, but you will end up pushing what Brexit means in a direction that alienates a lot of particularly younger people.
Yeah. That's interesting that you should bring up the point of young people, because I wanted to move on to about sort of young Conservatives in this country and just, young people in general and sort of how most of our political leanings have shifted. Now, I'm speaking as a sort of, in my experience as a student at the University of Bristol. I did study politics and French, and there are very many sort of young people in this country that don't think that being a Conservative is even an option. It just doesn't sound right. Why would a young person that's looking, proud to be European and, since the EU clearly has a monopoly on what European identity is now, that don't really see conservatism as an option. Why do you think this shift has occurred in terms of just young people? I mean, young people are always rebellious anyway. You always have that generation of youngsters that...
Well, you know why? I think because people in the Conservative movement and people in the centre-right and people who believe in classical liberalism have been really bad at getting their ideas across. And this is why Turning Point is so important, because... 20 or 30 years, the left has had a monopoly on controlling the mainstream media, the television, the output of the BBC. There's a leftist bias, not necessarily a political bias, but a leftist bias in the output of so much of what they produce. Turning Point is really, I think, incredibly exciting because it's part of a new wave of new media initiatives. It's the democratization of opinion forming and comment. It allows centre-right voices and a plurality of opinion to be expressed. And I think it allows us to reach out to a rising generation who's starting to look around the world and ask fundamental questions. And for the first time in 20 or 30 years, they're being offered non-left-wing ideas as to how the world really works. And I think this is why it's so significant what you're doing. The reason why the millennials tended to be default towards the left and to Corbyn was because my generation was really bad at doing what you guys are doing. The reason why the new generation behind the millennials coming through, I think they call them Generation Z, or why there seemed to be a definitive shift towards free market libertarianism, I think is partly because of as a result of work that you guys are doing.
Yeah, so we're kind of seeing a resurgence. I mean, but going back to Corbyn, the youth is a sweet spot. A lot of young people voted to remain in the EU mostly because of Corbyn. And at the last election, a huge proportion of his voters were sort of young people, young sort of leftists. I think they were under the age of 30. Why do you think his sweet spot is the left? I don't really understand. He's not particularly charismatic.
I think you've got to be a little careful. 3 years ago, he seemed like the future. Kind of strange for a guy who was the retro 70s, but anyway, he seemed like the future. Why? Because he was different. He was novel. This was a guy who would, at the end of the day, take the bus home from the House of Commons to his constituency home. He seemed authentic.
Even though he's conveniently a millionaire.
Well, I genuinely, you can have a go at Corbyn for many things, but actually I think that side of him the humble guy who doesn't live.
You don't think it's an act?
No, I think he's genuinely like that. But there are good, humble. I think he's humble in that sense. He's not. I don't think he's materially greedy at all. I think he really does have an allotment. There's good in everyone. You give him his due. And I think that seemed quite appealing to people who had for years listened to politicians like Ed Balls, Ed Miliband, George Osborne, David Cameron. These are people who could never give a straight answer to a question. Think of George Osborne. Think of Ed Miliband. Whatever you asked them, they would always have some phony-sounding, bogus BS answer. And then you get someone like Farage or someone like Corbyn, and people warm to it. Or I would say someone like Boris Johnson. This idea that this thirst for authentic politicians, I think, is what appeals. And this is why I actually think Boris could take on and defeat Corbyn in a way that none of the previous Tory leaders could. May, I think, stumbled against Corbyn because May could never give a straight answer to anything, and I don't think she even knew what a straight answer would be. She spoke in sort of politician riddles. I think that was because of how she thought. I think fundamentally she spoke in cliché because she thought in cliché. Mm-hmm. That's why she did relatively badly against Corbyn. But I think with Boris, you're talking about someone who says what he means and means what he says, and I think he's got a real chance of defeating Corbyn. But I wouldn't take anything for granted. If Corbyn came within 4,000 votes of becoming Prime Minister at the last election, 4,000 people have voted differently in certain constituencies, he would have become Prime Minister. It's going to be one heck of a fight, but he can be beaten. But I think it takes someone as authentic as Boris to do it.
So do you think that's how Boris can sort of win the youth? Is it with his authenticity? Do you think he needs something else? Because I feel like young people, a bit of conundrum. Speaking as a young person myself, I don't really sort of know where the youth in this country are looking towards, because on one hand they have to admit this 3-year-long Brexit ordeal is a bit ridiculous. This whole, I think everyone has a bit of Brexit fatigue, but on the other hand there's a bit of a wound there that all these young people are lamenting, saying, oh, you've stripped me of my European identity, whatever that means. Just looking ahead, do you think what do you think it is for young people to have that sort of optimism looking forward, and who do you think can bring that in the general election?
I wouldn't confuse what the BBC and the broadcasters say young people think with what young people actually think. I think the habit that the mainstream pundits do of presuming what people think knows no bounds. We're constantly told that London is a Remain city. Well, actually, I think I'm right in saying that 4 out of 10 people in London voted to leave. Sure, more people voted Remain, but a significant number of people in London voted to leave. And similarly in places like Clacton, where Leave was in the majority, there were significant numbers of Remainers. So we shouldn't assume this sort of black and white narrative of the lazy establishment pundits. But I don't think we should obsess too much in the coming election, or I don't think we should obsess exclusively about Brexit. If you are 18 or 19 and you're coming up to your first election, people would have been going on about Brexit for pretty much
your entire teenage
existence. Yeah. So Boris needs to have clear ideas on other stuff. One thing I think really does need change, and I don't have all the answers, but there does need to be changes, is the university fees. The universities in this country run a cartel, and they run a racket where people get a place, every university, they take $9,000 a year in tuition fees. It's a one-way bet for the universities because they're leveraged their eyeballs on debt. They get this guaranteed slice of future revenue from students passing through their doors now who are going to have to be paying off this debt for years to come. The interest rate on it is extortionate. I don't think it's a sustainable model. And I think some of the universities are not only leaving students with massive debts, I think some of those universities, whisper it gently, just between you, me, and hopefully tens of thousands of listeners, they're actually giving pretty rubbish degrees, some of them. And I think this is a scandal that needs to be addressed. I think there are other things Boris could do that would help young people. I know students who, in fact, I was talking to some recently who got threatened with court action for not paying their licence fee to the BBC. The BBC is another cartel. It's this great big oligarchy that takes money on threat of sending people to prison for watching TV programs that a lot of young people just don't watch.
Actually, I've unceremoniously. This is another reason why I don't watch TV. It's just one of those like private battles of mine. Like, you're not going to get my money, even though I still pay. It makes me feel good knowing that I'm not actively contributing.
You're not subsidising Gary Lineker's pensions.
Yeah, that helps me sleep at night quite nicely. So. Just one last question, sort of with regarding young people. How do you think young people should approach getting involved in politics? Because I tend to get a lot of messages about sort of, I want to get involved in politics. I actually like the debate. I don't really consider myself a leftist or a sort of a right-leaning person, but I see a lot of the work that Turning Point and other organisations do, and I just want to get involved in the debate, or maybe even stand as.
This is why Turning Point is so important. I mean, trust me, I've been in different political parties, and sometimes it's really frustrating because you have a whole package with a political party, and quite often people want to be involved in an organisation like Turning Point that gives you can believe in certain things, you can get involved, but you're not signing up to being a small cog in a giant corporate party machine. And that's why I think organisations like Turning Point are so important. So get involved in Turning Point, naturally sign up on all the social media things, to sign up to affiliated channels like Carswell channel on YouTube, which is
lovely plug in there.
And take the initiative. If someone's coming to your campus, great, make sure you go along. If someone isn't coming to your campus, contact Ollie, contact you, Esther, and say, we don't have anything on campus. What can I do to organise it? You'll probably find that actually, if you're thinking like this, if you're watching this on campus, if you've been back at university after a long summer break and you're watching this and you're thinking, what can I do? You'll probably find there's someone else within a few hundred yards of you thinking the same thing. So get in touch with Turning Point and do something about it.
All right. I just want to ask this question because there's really been I've been having these debates with friends, and I feel like I'm overly pessimistic when it comes to the future of the EU, not Britain in the EU. I don't really think it's going to last after our exit. I don't think it's gonna continue to be as it is now. I think it's very much going to evolve. What do you think is the future of the EU? Because I feel like nobody's really been talking about that. Because even though we've been squabbling about sort of how to leave the EU and people don't really know what they're voting for, which is just ridiculous, we're not talking about what the EU is actually, what their vested interest is in all this. Imagine a Britain that actually succeeds after Brexit, that's open to sort of all different countries and forms of investment and all the rest of it. What do you think the Germans and the French and the Italians, all these people that are actually not too keen on the EU, what do you think they're going to do? And what do you think the EU's future is going to be ultimately?
I was playing tennis a couple of days ago with a French friend of mine who reminded me that London is, I think, the fourth largest French city in the world. And he reminded me in the nicest possible way that there are lots and lots of French people, and we should take this as a compliment. Yeah. But just as I was losing 2 sets to love, and I kind of thought to myself, it's flattering to us, but it's actually a little bit irritating to French people, because what does that tell you about the state of France? That young, ambitious French graduates are having to leave France and go to London
and learn
English to set up a startup company, to work in finance like this friend of mine was doing, to do all these things. Europe's not working for millions of Europeans. Since the euro was created, far from creating prosperity in Europe, Europe has seen massive debt levels, massive unemployment levels. I really fear that once we leave, I know that once we've left the European Union, we will prosper as a country. Our long-term per capita GDP growth will be significantly higher than Europe. I know that we'll start to do things to tackle the productivity problems. What I fear is that Europe will continue to be governed by this technocratic elite who will continue to overregulate, overtax, keep Europe behind this protective wall. And Europe will basically become a giant version of Venice. Okay. Venice used to be the commercial hub of the world. Venice used to be like Silicon Valley is today. It used to be the place where it was at economically. Today, you think of Venice, it's a giant museum. Europe's in danger of becoming a museum. Europe's in danger of, in 30 or 40 years' time, being the place where Chinese and Japanese students go to perfect their language skills.
And then go back home.
Because Europe is just not growing. Europe is not growing because it's governed by a self-serving elite who don't want to recognize these problems. And every time people in a European country get really frustrated, They vote for someone who promises to do something about this, but the European elite always finds a way, like they're trying to do in the House of Commons, of getting their placeman to unravel the populism. So, I fear that, European politics is going to basically become a contest between awful technocrats like Macron and, loony extremists like Le Pen. And this bothers me. But,
I don't think it's going to last. I know it's really pessimistic. I don't see the EU. I mean, quite frankly, I even sort of question whether Macron can win a general election in the next few years.
You say it can't last because it doesn't work, but you're being, if I may say so, horribly empirical. If you had been born in Russia in 1917, when the Bolsheviks took over, a sane person would say, Bolshevism isn't going to work. Yeah. It didn't stop them ruining your life for 70 years. This is it. The European Union is a catastrophic way of organising a continent. I don't think it's as bad as Bolshevism, but it's still a bad way of running the continent.
There's quite a difference.
But they're going to persist with it. They're going to persist with it. They simply haven't made the reforms they should have done. I mean, look at it another way. Angela Merkel came to office pointing out that Europe spent a vast percentage of the world's welfare spending was in Europe, and yet very little of the growth and the innovation was in Europe. Tony Blair, the French president, they've all pointed out that Europe hasn't produced these great big tech innovators like the Chinese have and like the Americans have. But what have they done about it? Absolutely sweet FA. Am I allowed to say that on your show?
You can say that. It's YouTube. Yeah, you can say that. Yeah, they've done nothing. So what do you think about the general direction that UKIP is taking at the moment? Do you think it's sort of going to flourish? Or
I think it's a bit tasteless to talk about the politically deceased. I joined them because I wanted to leave the European Union. I wanted a referendum, and I wanted to make sure that Euroscepticism was defined by the right people and the right campaign, where a broad range of people were involved. I left UKIP because I felt that job done, and I'm really pleased to see that, as always, Nigel's followed my lead out the party. I think UKIP's still going in theory, but I'm not sure that it exists in practice.
I mean, that's the most diplomatic way I've heard of it. Anyway.
There's that great philosophical question, isn't there? If a tree falls down in a wood
forest, yeah.
and no one hears it, did it make a sound? If a party exists but no one votes for it, is it a party? I don't know. Interesting philosophical question. But I think that's the stage that my former party is at.
Well, if you think it could be a political zombie. And you're just moving around. But
another way of looking at it is maybe it's kind of actually been the most successful party in British political history ever. It only managed to return one MP in a general election ever. But you know what? We're about to leave the EU.
Job done. We're leaving the EU. Well, I mean, if, the MPs just... I mean, if in theory UKIP were popular now, would you feel comfortable being in the party? Or
No.
Your time is done?
They seem to make a lot of mileage by having a go at other Britons from different backgrounds and different heritages. Because it's difficult enough getting along as it is without a bunch of people stirring things up. There are lots of difficult questions we have to have as a country. We have to, I think, talk a lot about multiculturalism. We have to talk about where the boundaries lie between private religious belief and observance and what you should expect to do, particularly when it comes to things like education.
Yeah.
There's a whole complicated debate to be had, and we've got to have it. We've got to have it honestly. We've got to have it frankly. And I think, from my point of view, we've got to be absolutely robust in defending civic, open values. But the last thing you want is a bunch of troublemakers stirring things up from the sidelines.
And I think that's the last thing we need with such a divided country. Anyway, over Brexit, I'm not sure UKIP would be a very good idea right now. But yeah,
let's not speak well or ill of the politically dead.
All right. Okay. So we like to finish off every podcast with just some quick fire questions, really random. Just pick and choose. Don't think too much about it. All
okay.
Right, okay. Boris or Farage?
Boris. Obs.
Okay. Obs. Oh, you're getting it. You're getting it. All right. The Queen or Margaret Thatcher? Ooh.
I cheer both.
You have to choose one. Can't be greedy.
Pass.
Natural. No, it's not possible. All right, okay. Capitalism or corporatism?
Capitalism.
Okay. Cameron or May?
Neither. Can I have the Queen and Thatcher in return for May and Cameron? Okay.
I'm sure Shibugachi, that is brilliant. Okay. Trump or Romney? Ooh, American.
I'm going to be controversial. I think Trump.
I don't think that's controversial.
Well, Romney.
We're talking a true-blooded Republican. Okay, well.
I mean, there are lots of things about Trump I don't like, but I think Romney was a little bit like an American version of Theresa May.
Yeah, that's what I mean. But I don't know, because if I say true-blooded Republican, you know, a lot of them have sort of kind of fit into this mold. So yeah, I agree with you. All right then, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Esther. It's been a pleasure.
It has been, yes. Tune in for the next episode.